The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
Hello, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineering Watch Radio with the Global Alert News broadcast for the week of March 5th, 2016. This is broadcast on KQMS throughout Northern California. These shows are reposted under the radio section of geoengineeringwatch.org after the live broadcast on Saturday mornings. It's a commercial-free hour. We have no commercial sponsors because we don't want to break up the message. We need the time to get as much news out as possible. A lot to cover today, an awful lot. Can't get through it all in any given day, but I'll try. Want to announce again, 9/11 screening of architects and engineers for truth. 2,300 architects and engineers from around the globe, some of the top people in their field. Free screening in Reading, March 12th, Saturday, 2 p.m. in the afternoon till 5. That's an award-winning documentary on what really happened on 9/11, what the investigation from 2,300 architects and engineers says. This is a jaw-dropping documentary. It's not patriotic to assume the official narrative and to refuse to investigate. That's not patriotism. That's simply willful ignorance. If you really want to know what you weren't told about 9/11, come to this event. Get a free commercial DVD. Nobody's selling anything. We're simply trying to sound the alarm. So you can have a free DVD to take home to show to others. You'll see a jaw-dropping documentary. You can participate in the question and answer after the film screening, which will also include the subject of global climate engineering, major and immediate threat that all of us face. Free DVDs on that issue as well. Again, March 12th, Reading Library, free event. Please come and find out what you haven't been told. Southern California, on March 18th and 19th, Cal Jam event. I'm speaking there along with a number of other speakers. This event, information on this can be found online under Cal Jam. A major event with much data that's needed on many subjects at that event. Also speaking at Sonoma State University on April 27th. I've been asked by professors at the university to give a PowerPoint presentation on the ongoing climate engineering insanity at a 400-seat auditorium in Sonoma State University. There'll be announcements on that on geoengineeringwatch.org coming up. Now, as we continue to progress week after week with the artificially pumped up stock market, and that seems to be most people's bottom line. They listen to the political theater about how this candidate or that candidate is going to make everything better. How can we possibly buy into that sort of idiocracy at this point in time? So let's look at a little bit of reality, a few quick real headlines from real sources, what our media doesn't tell us, to give us an indication of what's really going on with the economy. Here's headlines from the previous week. Plunging manufacturing numbers mean that it's time to hit the panic button for the global economy. That's one we don't see on the cover of the local record Searchlight or on KRCR, isn't it? Another headline, major source. The shipping industry isn't doing as well as it looks. An excerpt from that report. Commodity prices and demand are so bad, freight rates for the biggest ships don't even cover a third of the cost of their cruise. Why? Because there's too much shipping. Global economy is screeching to a halt. Container ships are being idled and anchored in places around the globe, dismantled in many cases. The paradigm we've known is screeching to a halt. Another headline. Global central banks continue longest gold buying spree since the Vietnam War. They're preparing for what's coming. Should you? Another headline. China woes hammer neighboring manufacturing industries. China is screeching to a halt, in other words. So here's a following headline to back up that headline. China plans to lay off millions of state workers. It's happening. Governments around the globe and the media they control are trying to hide what's happening. Again, as the biosphere implodes, and it is imploding, if you don't believe it, you will, the industrialized economy will follow when nature can't produce anymore the 75% of all global GDP that it has historically produced for free. Once that can't happen, the economy screeches to a halt. Another headline. Antarctico, this is an oil production company, slashes 80% of onshore rigs to lay off 95% of contractors. This is a drilling company. Again, because all the oil in the world doesn't matter if the other resources aren't there to back it up. Another headline, world trade falls 13.8% in dollar volume. Another bit of news we don't see from our corporate media. Another headline, Eurozone will collapse, says former head of Bank of England. It's real hell. That's the full headline. A final headline, just to give a taste of what's going on around the globe that our media doesn't tell us about. And I'll give a few more examples of that in a moment. The other side of the global crisis, entropy and the collapse of civilization. These aren't just my statements or my headlines or my conclusions. These headlines are there from experts around the globe for those who care to look, for those who care to take their heads out of the sand and take a good look around and start looking past our local media weapons of mass distraction and denial, as I've outlined in previous weeks, the sort of flat-out, baseless, factless denial that comes from our local media here. Now, how about the political theater of insanity? Of course, it's still accelerating and being used as the weapon of mass distraction it's intended for. And this is what our media shows us. Not the headlines like I just read, but political mass distraction. As an example of that, Rubio accuses Trump of being a con artist. But I would argue this, perhaps Rubio should take a good long look in the mirror. And for those that don't yet get it, all the candidates are nothing more than con artists who are part of an unimaginably massive grand deception. It's time we figured that out. Industrialized, militarized civilization is already imploding. In the reality, it takes much more than just oil, again, to survive. It takes a functioning environment. The U.S. military has command centers all over the globe. But will all this military might, will all the occupation of all the foreign countries and all the acquisition of fossil fuels and other resources save us from a planet that has been completely decimated and that no longer supports life? And that's the track that we're on. That's exactly the track we're on. It's a mathematical fact. It's an indisputable fact for those who look at actual data. Global climate engineering still continues to be the epitome of industrialized, militarized insanity. And though our elected officials in California and 48 other states in the Union continue to lie about the climate engineering reality, at least in one state, there's a few elected officials with a sense of morality and the courage to back it up. That state is Rhode Island. Rhode Island proposed legislation on the critical issue of global climate engineering. I'm going to read from this proposed legislation, which has been recently updated. This is from the state of Rhode Island, the General Assembly, January session in 2016. The legislation reads, an act relating to health and safety, GeoEngineering, introduced by Representatives Macbeth and Price, introduced February 11, 2016, and referred to the House Environment and Natural Resources. Climate geoengineering is defined as large-scale manipulation of the global environment intended to manipulate the climate with the primary intention of reducing undesirable climate change caused by human beings. Solar radiation management approaches focused on reducing the amount of solar radiation absorbed by the Earth by an amount sufficient to offset some or all of the trapping of the infrared radiation by rising levels of greenhouse gases. Again, this is reading directly from legislation that was just updated and drafted in Rhode Island. This draft is still alive. It's on hold for the moment, but it's still alive. We're communicating with some of the committee members now. The Geoengineering Watch legal team is going to communicate with some of these committee members. But this is legislation from representatives, elected officials that have some courage, some morality, and some backbone, something that seems to be lacking in almost all other states. To continue with this draft about solar radiation management, it says these options include aerosol injection in the stratosphere. Now, what does that involve? That's the spraying of particulates into the atmosphere. Now, this is exactly what we see happening behind the jet aircraft that is not hard to decipher if you simply look up and connect the dots. You can't have grid patterns one day and nothing the next without something being sprayed. You can't turn a, quote, condensation trail on and off. And in fact, we know from high bypass turbofan jet engine technology, which is on all commercial aircraft, all military tankers, we should see nothing behind these aircraft except under the most extreme circumstances. The people in Rhode Island recognize this. Why don't our elected officials in California recognize it? So these aerosol injections, to go back to the document itself from Rhode Island, the aerosol injection in the stratosphere is to reflect incoming shortwave radiation from the sun back into space. The Rhode Island draft legislation against geoengineering continues. Potential but foreseeable hazards of solar radiation management and climate engineering could include decreased precipitation and evaporation, including alteration of monsoonal and rain patterns, and potentially delayed recovery of the ozone hole, all of which we see, in fact, that geoengineering not only delays recovery of the ozone hole, it is the primary cause of the ozone hole to begin with. This is not included in this draft, but this is what the hard science states. The draft continues. Producing reductions in regional rainfall that could rival those of past major droughts. Does that sound a little like California? Because that's exactly what the climate science says. It's exactly what the laws of physics state. When you fill the atmosphere with particulates, it has drastic effects on rainfall patterns. It's exactly what's happening in California and places all over the globe. The draft continues. This leads to winners and losers among the human population and possible conflicts over water. Sound a little bit like the Middle East? Remember I brought up in past shows, every single one of the Middle Eastern countries that has been destabilized and toppled, every single one has been droughted out into total societal disruption. Is that an accident? It's not an accident. It's the cause of climate modification, which is weather warfare, and we have the leaders of these countries on the floor of the United Nations stating that their countries, in the case of Iran, their president and vice president on the floor of the UN stating their country was being droughted out by NATO weather modification programs. Historical fact that our media is not telling us about. The Rhode Island draft against geoengineering continues. Reducing the total amount of direct sunlight reaching Earth's surface, which could reduce the effectiveness of solar energy systems, something I'll elaborate on a little bit further in this broadcast. Promoting an increase in acid rain loads from injection of aluminum oxide. Remember how many times on this broadcast I have talked about again and again and again the 70-plus lab tests taken in Shasta and Siskiyou counties alone, that our rain is packed full of aluminum, which means it's in the air column, which means we are all breathing it, which is directly connected to the epidemic levels of Alzheimer's, dementia, autism, respiratory ailments, respiratory infections. The list goes on and on and on. Representatives in Rhode Island, at least, are acknowledging this. The report continues. Aluminum oxide, particulates, gases, and other compounds which would cause adverse impacts, such compounds eventually fall into the troposphere, that's the lower level of the atmosphere that we breathe in, and rain out. It's in our rain. I just said that. Onto the land and ocean, including impacts on forests, crops, built structures, and ocean ecosystems, and numerous other potential consequences that produce air pollution. Now, I'm reading directly from a Rhode Island congressional draft against geoengineering. And yet we have our local media completely marginalizing this issue. We have congressional documents, presidential documents, 160 plus patents, military documents, film footage of it happening, lab tests from around the globe, and our local officials and agencies and media completely deny this real and present danger that's happening in our skies. I would ask, what are they going to say when the public wakes up to this? And they are waking up because it's getting too hard to hide this insanity. What will our local media and our local agencies and our local officials say once the public knows that they have been lying about the reality of this issue? We'll find out soon enough. The Rhode Island draft continues further. Again, numerous other potential consequences that would produce air pollution, air contaminants, and other as yet unforeseen environmental harms. When you fill the atmosphere with highly toxic particulates to rain down on the entire planet, bad things happen. Why would we think otherwise? At least this is being acknowledged from Rhode Island. And again, for the record, and this is only an excerpt from this Rhode Island draft, by the way. The full draft can be found if you search Rhode Island geoengineering legislation, or you can find it at geoengineeringwatch.org. Find it, read it for yourself. Posted by the state of Rhode Island. It's not our opinion, this is fact. And again, for the record, what's our Northern California Congressman Doug LaMalfa stated on this issue, even after he was given lab tests from California EPA? No reply at all. Denial now. In fact, you can see where I presented Mr. LaMalfa with test data from California EPA. If you search Congressman Doug LaMalfa, Dane, Wigington, geoengineering, you'll find a video where I present him with this data, and he looks like a deer in the headlights. Have we seen anything from Mr. LaMalfa about this critical issue? No, of course not. We know Mr. LaMalfa receives money from companies like Monsanto, who are actually capitalizing off the contamination of aluminum in the soils, because Monsanto is now producing aluminum-resistant seeds, drought-resistant seeds, UV-resistant seeds, because we have a completely decimated ozone layer. So why would Mr. LaMalfa say anything about geoengineering when he is actually receiving donations from a company like Monsanto that's capitalizing off the destruction caused by geoengineering? Connect the dots. Connect the dots. As the Rhode Island draft stated, a reduction in solar power. I know about this very directly. It's my background. My home was on the cover of the world's largest renewable energy magazine because of my alternative power systems. That's what got me to discover the issue of geoengineering to begin with, because I was losing massive amounts of solar power from whatever these aircraft were emitting. That's the primary purpose of geoengineering, to block the sun. So is it any wonder why we have governments like the United States and the UK cutting their solar power subsidies? Because why would these governments pay for solar power subsidies when they're actually paying to block the sun to begin with? And there's days when I lose 70 to 80% of my solar power uptake from what the aircraft are emitting in our skies. Now think about that. If you think a condensation trail can block 70 or 80% of solar power uptake, you're not living in reality. Condensation trail could not block that much sunlight. Particulates in the atmosphere that are designed to block sunlight can, and that's exactly what's happening. Exactly what's happening. So, and it's not just sunlight, by the way. Geoengineering decimates all forms of renewable energy. Solar, wind, and hydro. These same particulates in the atmosphere alter convection, which is what affects wind. So it greatly diminishes the output from wind turbines, solar panels, and because it has horrific effects on the hydrological cycle, the rain cycle, it greatly diminishes rain overall. That doesn't mean there's not deluges in other areas, as that moisture accumulates and comes down somewhere in massive amounts. Or if the geoengineers spray larger particulates for a larger condensation nuclei, rain can be triggered to come down in a deluge as well. But having a 12 kilowatt solar system, 3 wind turbines, and hydropower one of which should be working at any given time, I have long stretches now where I can't produce enough power from any of them because there's less sun, less wind, and less rain. All thanks to geoengineering. Now, how can all this go on in our skies without some acknowledgement coming from somewhere? And as I've stated in previous shows, again, the paid liars at institutions like the Weather Channel and other power structure-owned climate engineering cover-up so-called weather forecasting agencies who now make complete theater out of, for example, California possibly getting a few inches of rain over the next few days. Now, I remember growing up and through my early adult life when storms happened, it was not uncommon to get 4 or 5 inches of rain out of a single storm, and now they make theater out of the potential to have 4 or 5 inches of rain over a week's worth of storms. They make theater out of the Sierras perhaps getting a foot or two of snow in the middle of the largest El Nino year ever, in the middle of winter. I remember many, many feet of snow in a single storm in areas like Mammoth and other locations. But people's perceptions change as it happens slowly over time. They forget about what the weather once was like. They forget what a blue sky looked like. They start to accept the dirty, dingy, cobweb-like looking haze that floats above our heads so often now. It's come on slowly, so for many they simply accept it. Think back. Remember what a blue sky looked like. This is so imperative that people pay attention to what's going on, and there is no greater or no more immediate assault to all of us than the climate engineering insanity. Now, again, why don't we know this is going on? What's academia not telling us? How does academia and the climate science community always downplay the severity of what's happening? Not over-exaggerate, as many would like to believe, and many have been convinced of, because there's a lot of industrial, corporate, fossil fuel industry money put into the media system to try to convince you that this whole climate thing is being overblown. Look around you. If you think that, when we all hate Al Gore, that's not about Al Gore. I bring that up all the time. Al Gore is a criminal, a hypocrite. How could anybody produce a movie like Al Gore and own stocks in the very same companies he claimed to be against? Total hypocrisy. Al Gore, who consumed 10 times the power of his neighbors with no solar, flying around in corporate jets. No, I don't like Al Gore. Are carbon credits a sham? Yes. That doesn't change reality. You can't simply say because you don't like Al Gore, you're going to take the opposite position on everything. Because the fact is, the climate scientists have deceived us. That's true. But in the opposite direction of most people, what most people would like to conclude. The climate situation is far, far worse than anything that we have been told. Far worse. And geoengineering is fueling that fire overall. With climate engineering, short-term cool-downs can be achieved at the cost of a much worsened overall warming. So how do the climate scientists downplay the severity? Let me read this headline. Climate change could cause an extra 500,000 deaths in 2050. First of all, on the current trajectory, we won't be here in 2050. That's a mathematical fact based on current die-offs around the globe in the environment. We've lost almost 2/3 of Earth's wildlife populations in the last 40 years. 2/3 in 40 years. So we have here a scientific panel telling us we could be in trouble by 2050. People need to wake up. These headlines are designed to make you go back to sleep, to go buy your new car with nothing down and no interest and no payments for 6 months, thinking everything is wonderful when it's anything but. That's what these kind of headlines are designed to do. This headline, again, is comparable to saying if you leap off a 100-story building, you might get hurt when you hit the sidewalk. Does it take a scientist to tell us this? Now, and again, the time frames they give are always designed to make people be complacent. That it's somewhere off on the horizon, you don't need to worry about it. From this headline, here's an excerpt. London, from the Reuters Foundation. Climate change could cause significant changes to global diets. leading to more than 500,000 extra deaths in 2050 from illness such as stroke, cancer, heart disease, and experts said Wednesday. How about today? How about right now on planet Earth, when all of us are sucking in lungfuls of toxic heavy metals, when respiratory mortality from 2005 to 2010 has gone from 8th on the list to 3rd, we now think it may be 2nd, and the CDC is not telling us. How much death is climate engineering causing right now? Right now. We're the frogs in boiling water, getting sicker by the day, and trying to convince ourselves that nothing's wrong. It's time to wake up. Now, also, in regard to this headline that talks about the lack of food, right now we have oceans that are dying. We have massive reductions in fish populations, which I'm going to get to in a moment. How can these quote-unquote scientists try to claim that something may be bad in another 34 years? We're not living in reality, and the climate science community as a whole is failing us. It's failing humanity, grossly failing, criminally failing. Let's get to the oceans right now. How about another ocean update from the North American West Coast? Again, in previous shows, in fact, in some other shows in KQMS, again, I was accused of completely fabricating the ocean die-off. I challenge anyone, investigate what I'm saying. That's all I've ever asked. Don't believe someone's denial who doesn't want to face the truth, and this is the typical tactic for those in denial. They want to try to slander or throw mud at anybody who tries to tell the truth, because the truth is very scary for many people. So they feel somehow if they can shut you up from telling the truth, maybe they can live in their delusion a little longer. Not the case. Here's a headline from the Seattle Times. 2016, sardines off the West Coast have continued on steep decline. Sardines being the base of the food chain for much of the marine ecosystem, by the way, have continued on steep decline, with populations this summer forecast to be down 93% from 2007. Not that they were at normal levels of 2007 either. So how low are we really? 93% drop in 9 years? Think about that. Is that not a cause for alarm? According to a draft assessment from the National Marine Fisheries Service, last year the sardine implosion was so severe that the Pacific Fishery Management Council voted to call off the season that was scheduled to start in July for the West Coast fleets. The stocks of sardines aged 1 year or older are forecast to be 64,000 metric tons, about a third lower than the 2015 assessment. It's even worse than they told us, even worse. Albert Carter of Ocean Gold Seafood, who serves on the Pacific Fishery Management Council Advisory Committee, said if populations have continued to decline, he does not expect a 2016 season. No season for the fishing fleet. Where are the headlines on this? Why don't we see this on our local media, like KRCR or the Record Searchlight? No, they're too busy telling us about Trump and Rubio accusing each other of being con artists. Again, the whole system is nothing but a con. We have to face that. Another headline, Energy News. This is from a source called Energy News. It's actually quite a mainstream source. Sickened animals unlike anything doctors have ever seen on West Coast. Quote from the report, they're eating themselves from the inside out. Cancers, liver, pancreas, intestines shut down, infested with parasites, and immune to antibiotics. Unprecedented catastrophe to cause loss of 200,000 sea lions. 200,000. That's 2/3 of the total sea lion populations along our coast. Is that not cause for alarm? I'm simply asking for people to wake up and look at the truth. Time is not on our side. Another headline from The Guardian. Unprecedented numbers of dead starving seals washing ashore as Pacific Ocean warms, with experts saying they're preparing for the worst in 2016. According to National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Fisheries, there's been a huge increase in stranded sea lions. Now, this continues from every front. Again, the headlines are there for anybody who looks, and don't think you're going to get it from our local media. final headline, also from Energy News, because this is about energy. Quote, listen to this headline. Again, yet more that we're not being told. I alluded to this some last week. This is another headline on the same subject. Uncontrollable radioactive flow coming from nuclear plant near New York City. Actual releases are, and listen to this, actual releases are trillions of times, not millions or billions of times higher than reported, trillions of times higher than reported during the latest leak. Cracks in multiple spent fuel pools. Intense investigation underway to see if it can be stopped. Shouldn't we hear something about this through all the stupidity we see from our corporate-controlled media? I would think so, but you're not going to see it. You have to look for yourself. Now, to follow up on that headline again, this is from Huffington Post. Indian Point contaminates the Hudson River with uncontrollable radioactive flow. For more than a decade, it has been impossible for operators of the Indian Point nuclear power plant to stop highly radioactive reactor spent fuel pool coolant from leaking into the groundwater and migrating to the Hudson River. There is no indication that the company has developed the ability to prevent the latest uncontrolled leaks. This is business as usual. Everybody needs to realize that. Business as usual. And by the way, in regard to the business as usual spraying in our skies, if you think our local agencies would tell you, in Reading, I spoke in front of the California Air Resources Board with a room full of farmers, and the Resources Board stated at that meeting, on the record, they have no regard or concern for anything that's sprayed into the skies, not in their jurisdiction. They don't care, and they don't want to talk about it. That's a fact. That's why massive radiation leaks can happen. Spraying of our skies with completely unregulated climate modification programs can happen, because agencies are designed not to address these issues. They're not there for our safety or our common welfare, as people have been trained to believe. Back to the radiation leak. There is no indication that the company has developed, again, the ability to prevent the latest uncontrolled leaks from following the underground waterways into the Hudson. And because the river is a tidal estuary flowing as much as 20 miles above and below the nuclear site, radioactive contaminants may be sucked into the drinking water system of several river towns. Entergy representatives, that's who owns Indian Point, declined to comment on planned and unplanned radioactive discharges. Now, how can we have planned discharges? It's just scheduled releases of radioactive contamination, as if it's normal or okay. So they refuse to comment on the discharges into the environment. The sequence of events leading to the leaks of radioactive liquids from Indian Point is the subject of, again, an intense investigation to determine how the leak occurred and whether or not it can be stopped. How wonderful is nuclear power? I get asked all the time, why would they do this to themselves? They being, all roads lead to the central bankers. That's who prints the money, funds the militaries, controls everything. I get asked, why would they do this to themselves? And I give examples over and over. Quote unquote, they, those in power, those who print the money, do this to themselves all the time. We have Fukushima that may kill us all. We have Indian Point. We have God knows how many other nuclear plants leaking that we haven't discovered yet. And they're building more, as if nuclear power is safe. We have quote-unquote climate scientists like James Hansen from NASA, who the environmental community seems to hold on a pedestal as if he's some sort of demigod, himself promoting nuclear power. And this is a scientist who claims to care about the environment, James Hansen, on a local radio station with a local global warming blogger advocate for the Searchlight. Sometime back, I was on air with climate scientist Simon Donner from UC British Columbia, and when I challenged Mr. Donner, who claimed they were not spraying in our skies, and how, as a scientist, he could possibly make such a definitive statement, this blogger, who I know very well for the Record Searchlight, who has a climate science blog for the Searchlight, I was unplugged from the air from this climate scientist that he seems to worship and doesn't question, a climate scientist who says nothing about the climate engineering and thus is lying about the most dire issue of all. The hypocrisy is everywhere. It's not just from one side of the political fence or the other. It's from all sides. There is more than enough denial to go around on all fronts. If that denial isn't cured, our planet will soon be too badly damaged from many fronts to continue supporting life. If you don't believe this, you haven't looked at the facts, and you won't be able to hide from those facts for much longer. You can quote me on that. On the trajectory that we are on, the planet will not support life that much longer. It's a mathematical fact. Again, we've lost 2/3 of Earth's wildlife in the last 40 years, and that rate is accelerating. How much longer do you think that can go on? Simply asking the question. Investigate for yourself. Now, how about another issue? Is the San Andreas Fault about to shift? Unprecedented amounts of carbon monoxide released in the atmosphere along the west coast of the U.S. On February 27th, enormous amounts of carbon monoxide leaked into the atmosphere along the west coast of America. It's the amount of carbon monoxide which is simply stunning, the headline states. It is well understood that large amounts of carbon monoxide is released into the atmosphere just before an earthquake. However, the amount of carbon monoxide released on the 27th of February, this author says, as far as can be determined, was unimaginably huge. Now, what did official sources say about this release of carbon monoxide? And again, official sources are there to hide reality from the population. That's their purpose. And as would be expected, NASA did their best to lie about the issue. Just as was the case after Fukushima, by the way, the Fukushima nightmare that unleashed radiation that's still being unleashed, bombarding the U.S. West Coast. And the West Coast radiation monitoring stations were shut down after Fukushima, and the so-called safe levels of ionizing radiation were radically raised. How do you suddenly have a higher safe level of radiation? It's called hiding the truth. In some cases, those levels were raised 10,000%. How is it suddenly safer to have 10,000 times more radiation than it was the day before? The American population is populations around the globe, but most especially the American population, completely asleep at the wheel. So much is happening around us right now. There'll be no hiding from it for much longer. So in the case of this massive carbon monoxide leak, what exactly did NASA say to hide this problem from the public? They said this: erroneous CO2 emissions over California cause unrealistic CO2 concentration in GeoS5 model. NASA continues, elevated carbon monoxide CO concentrations over California in the GeoS5 products since February 25th are incorrect. They're a consequence of unrealistic emissions derived from satellite observations of fires, which led to elevated concentration of atmospheric CO2. Do you believe that? Does anybody remember any forest fires in the last several weeks in the state of California? Really? How big can the lies get? And how much will the public accept? The same NASA who tells us what we see in our skies is just condensation. When we have film footage of tankers turning on and off, nozzles visible, aluminum raining down on us, barium, strontium, manganese, lead, massive amounts of toxic metals, all named in climate engineering patents, and NASA denies all of this. How much of this sort of lying will the American population accept, and at what cost? Again, we're not being told what sort of insanity is being carried out in our atmosphere that has unimaginably dire ramifications. And let's tie this in to Fukushima. What factors relating to the catastrophic Japanese earthquake were we never told about, and how might these same factors be related to the massive carbon monoxide release just mentioned? And let's start with this study from internationally recognized research institution MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Now, directly over the epicenter for the Japanese quake, credible, highly regarded institutions like MIT noted extremely anomalous atmospheric heating. I want to read directly from the MIT report. Atmosphere above Japan heated rapidly before the M9 quake. Follow me through, because I'm going to tie this into the recent carbon monoxide release. Infrared emissions above the epicenter of the Japanese quake increased dramatically in the days before the devastating earthquake, say scientists. Geologists have long puzzled over the anecdotal reports, which means they don't know why the atmosphere heated, obviously, of strange atmospheric phenomena. This is right off the MIT report in the days before the big earthquake. But good data to back up these stories has been hard to come by. In recent years, however, various teams have set up atmospheric monitoring stations in earthquake zones, and a number of satellites are capable of sending back data about the state of the upper atmosphere and the ionosphere specifically. Remember ionosphere heaters we talk about a lot, like HAARP, during the earthquake. Last year, we looked at some fascinating data from the Demeter spacecraft showing a significant increase in ultra-low frequency, like HAARP puts out, radio signals before the magnitude 7 Haiti earthquake, also in 2010. Another coincidence? Remember what ionosphere heaters do. They send that type of frequency, they can bounce it off the atmosphere because of a sprayed layer of reflecting particles, and that signal can go right back down into the strata, heating the strata of the planet. So the report continues. The NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland and others presented data from the great Tohoku earthquake, which devastated Japan on March 11th. This is the Fukushima quake. Their results are eye-opening. They say that before the M9 earthquake, the total electron content of the ionosphere increased dramatically over the epicenter, reaching a maximum 3 days before the quake. What does an ionosphere heater do? It causes an electrical chain reaction in the ionosphere, heating it. Think about that and tie this into the Japanese quake and tie it back into the carbon release that just happened in California. At the same time, satellite observations showed a big increase in the infrared emissions from above the epicenter, which peaked in the hours before the quake. In other words, the atmosphere was heating up, exactly what the ionosphere heaters do. These kinds of observations are consistent with an idea called lithosphere-atmosphere-ionosphere coupling mechanism. Now, listen to this statement from the report. The thinking is that in the days before the earthquake, the great stresses in a fault, as it is about to give, caused the release of large amounts of radon. Now, what you have is the scientists at MIT trying to put the cart before the horse. They're somehow trying to figure out why the pressure building in an earthquake would cause the atmosphere to heat. Because they can't talk about HAARP, they won't talk about HAARP or the other ionosphere heaters. They will never mention the fact that these signals can be bounced off the atmosphere and sent straight down into strata, heating that strata, causing pressure, and thus potentially triggering seismic activity. You would think we would have seen a headline somewhere, oh, by the way, the atmosphere above the Japanese quake epicenter was very anomalously heated in the days and weeks before that happened. You would think we would see a headline somewhere, but our media doesn't want us to connect that kind of dots. And for the general public, the fact that such weapons exist is something the public doesn't want to know. And I stress, this report is coming from one of the most recognized and respected research institutions in the world. I want to finish this report. These emissions of electrons go to the effect the ionosphere and its total electron content. It certainly makes sense that the lithosphere, atmosphere, and ionosphere are coupled in a way that can't be measured when one of them is perturbed. The question is to what extent the new evidence backs up this idea. The Japan earthquake is the largest to have struck the island in modern times and will certainly turn out to be among the best studied. Bottom line, we know ionosphere heaters are located around the globe. We know they are immensely powerful, can create immense heating in the ionosphere. We know those signals can be bounced off a reflective atmosphere that's filled with light-scattering, reflective, electrically conductive particles. Signal can be sent straight back down into strata, where it causes vibrations that can heat that strata. Is something like that going on over the U.S. West Coast? We can't know. We can't know, but this incredibly anomalous release of carbon monoxide, if you watch the film, it's available online in many locations from NASA. Extremely alarming. You can't make up what that film shows, and NASA simply comes out and says, our bad, we made a mistake. You can't make up a film like that. We saw water tests, in fact, Bella Vista water, some years back. They don't test for these elements now, but they came out with a report, which I saw, that said, we made a mistake on our testing for aluminum. It's actually 1,000 times lower than we said. They said move the decimal point back to the left 3 places. That's 1,000 times reduction of the actual reading. Agencies hiding contamination from Indian Point to Fukushima, hiding, covering up the kind of weapons that are being used around the globe like ionosphere heaters. It's time to wake up. On that note, I'm going to read a short excerpt from a report from the most internationally recognized climate or geoengineer of all, David Keith. And David Keith I had an exchange with at an international geoengineering conference in 2010. That can be seen online, where Keith stated in that conference, after I confronted him, had he done any study on his proposal of putting 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates into the atmosphere annually, he first responded, paraphrased, well, there's a lot of particles in the air already, a little more won't hurt. When I confronted him with the fact that those particles were not aluminum, he said, let me be more careful. Have we studied this? No. Could terrible things happen tomorrow? We don't know. This is what the most internationally recognized geoengineer of all, David Keith from Harvard, stated to me at an international conference, and it's on film, on the record. Search David Keith, Dane, Wigington, and you can watch this. So what does a recent research paper from internationally recognized, most recognized geoengineer, David Keith from Harvard University, say about geoengineering? It says, whatever method is used to create an artificial radiative forcing solar geoengineering layer is at best an imperfect method for reducing climate impacts. That's a mild statement. It's imperfect to scatter light reflecting particles throughout the sky that are highly toxic, and that's the best he can say is imperfect. The report from David Keith continues. For producing radiative forcing, we'll have a set of technological specific impacts, such as ozone loss. Remember how much I've talked about that, arising from the introduction of aerosol particles into the stratosphere, sprayed from jet aircraft, of course. His report continues. The loss of stratospheric ozone and an increase in diffuse light, remember I talked about that with the solar panel loss, the light that's lost, these light scattering particles, of course, completely alter the light that shines through them as our high skies are completely hazed out, have direct impacts on ecosystems. No surprise, when toxic particles rain down over the entire planet, toxifying every breath we take, of course it has effects on ecosystems. Dr. Keith acknowledges that here. Impacts on human health as well, the report states. Continuing with the report, the consequences of stratospheric heating are indirect and more speculative. In other words, they don't know. Continuing with the report, geoengineering with sulfate aerosols might heat the stratosphere by several degrees, increasing stratospheric water vapor concentrations. This would in turn exacerbate ozone loss and create a positive radiative forcing that would offset some of the reduction in forcing from solar radiation management. What's that mean? It means that there are hugely negative consequences that might completely negate the very effect they're trying to have by spraying the atmosphere full of light scattering particles. Isn't this exactly like the pharmaceutical commercials we see every day? Take this for a particular ailment, and by the way, here's 50 other things that are far worse than what you're claiming to treat to begin with. Same mentality with geoengineering. The report continues, heating the lower stratosphere is reasonably certain that with all else equal, a geoengineering method that does not heat the lower stratosphere is preferable to one that does. What does he say there? He says all things being equal, it's preferable that what we're trying to do actually works instead of not working. Does it take a scientist to tell us that? And how insane is it, again, this whole solar radiation management phenomenon, filling the sky with light scattering particles? We have the admission here by the most internationally recognized climate science or geoengineer of all, David Keith, stating these horribly negative known consequences. Let's get to the unknown consequences. The report continues. However, we have not resolved this discrepancy, so our estimate of heating for aluminum scattered in the atmosphere should be taken as uncertain. In other words, we don't know. Again. So the report finishes. Our results suggest that aluminum, may have a less severe technologically specific risk than sulfates. This is just a grand experiment, and all they can say is one thing might not be as bad as another. That's what he's stating here. While the injected mass necessary to achieve radiative forcing, in other words, blocking the sun, and the intended mass was 20 million tons, by the way, that's stated by David Keith on the record, to put 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates into the atmosphere annually for all of us to breathe, is equivalent whether employing aluminum or sulfate aerosol. The ozone depletion is more severe with geoengineering. It is important to note, the final paragraph on this report, the injection of substances like aluminum nanoparticulates have a much greater unknown unknowns. How about that? The unknown unknowns. It's been going on for 70 years. We know what's happening. We know exactly what's happening. The ozone layer is being destroyed. The entire surface of the planet is being contaminated. That's what's happening. Now, in reference to another geoengineer, Ken Caldera, by the way, he's well known, from Stanford University. What did Ken Caldera state on the record that he used to do at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory? And you can find this on the record. We have an audio recording of it on geoengineeringwatch.org. Internationally recognized geoengineer Ken Caldera stated that he would discuss with his colleagues at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory how to seed clouds with pathogens to infect the populations below. This is what your government scientists are doing, many of them. This information, again, is on geoengineeringwatch.org. Now, I want to expand on just how bad the climate situation is quickly. February, the old normal is gone. This is a recent headline from the last week. February shatters global temperature records. February 2016 was the most above normal month ever in human record keeping. This refers to the global average temperatures. To add a few more statistics to that, we just passed, I believe, the 370th month in a row of above normal global temperatures, 40 years in a row. We have no snow, again, in places like Alaska for the Iditarod dog sled race. And this is a statistical fact that I'm about to give, and people will question this. I challenge you. Please just investigate what I'm saying. The planet is heating right now at the rate of 4 Hiroshima nuclear bombs per second. That's to say that the heating is equal to the thermal energy released in 4 Hiroshima-sized nuclear detonations per second, 400,000 per day. Most of this heat is going into the oceans, but it's now being released. We're in free fall. Those who don't believe it, you will. Wait and see. Look past headlines, investigate for yourself. So, again, will geoengineering help to cool the planet that's superheating? No. Over 70 years of climate engineering and the data accumulated with that, we know geoengineering is not only not helping to cool the planet overall, but it's radically worsening the overall warming. Short-term cooling in exchange for worsened overall warming, in addition to contaminating the entire surface of the planet and every breath we take. Geoengineering programs are nothing short of biological warfare and environmental terrorism. The ongoing climate engineering crimes are aggressively denied by official agencies and much of academia, who are so committed to this lie of denial that they cannot turn back. So much of the science community has completely failed and completely betrayed the human race and life on Earth. This goes for the media community as well, and our quote-unquote elected officials. What good is science and technology without the wisdom and the virtue to use this knowledge benevolently and not malevolently? The horizon is dark indeed. There's no denying that. But we must not succumb to the power structure programming that tries to convince us that we have no voice in the matter, that tries to convince us that we are powerless. If all of us march together in the battle for truth and the greater good, we have immense power, and the cowardly criminal cabal that currently rules the world knows it. Don't be distracted from your part in the present. Don't convince yourself that someone else, somewhere else, is keeping an eye on the horizon, so you don't have to. This is a lie. Each and every one of us are needed to educate ourselves. Each and every one of us needs to abandon false perceptions and conclusions in exchange for verifiable realities. Each of us needs to prioritize our efforts and energies toward the critical fight for the future of our children. This is not an option, it's an obligation. Make your voice heard while there's yet time. Until next week, This is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.